It says attendees are still on hold, though.
Well, do you want me to push the Start Broadcast button?
Yeah, because they'll just see my screen.
The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Did you hear that?
Yep, I think we're live.
Okay. I'll be muted.
Good morning, everyone. We're going to get started in about 1 minute. Okay, good morning. We are going to get started. My name is Emily Mira, and I work for Building Changes, an organization that works in Washington State to end family homelessness. And I'm here with two colleagues, Liza Burrell and Ann Buer, and we will be moderating today's webinar, Working with Landlords, Engagement, Fair Housing, Landlord Tenant Law, and the Balance of Both, hosted by Building Changes and in partnership with the Washington Department of Commerce. I hope you're in the right place this morning. So this is our third and final webinar in a series focused on key approaches within rapid rehousing to help families end their homelessness and stabilize in housing. So some of you may be joining us for the first time, while others have attended all three. Either way, welcome, and we are happy to have you. So folks know the webinar will be recorded. It is being recorded, and it will be posted on Building Changes and Commerce's websites. And that's also where you can find the recordings and slide decks of the previous two webinars. And so we'll also try to, go slowly with the content, but if you feel like we're clicking through too fast, you can find the information later for your reference. There are 4 objectives for today's webinar. Participants will be exposed to best practices to engaging and retaining private landlords. You'll learn about common fair housing violations and approaches to supporting families and working with landlords in that process. We hope to increase your awareness of existing statewide resources for fair housing and tenant rights services. And lastly, you'll have an opportunity to get connected to others in the field for peer learning around this topic. You will hear from 3 presenters today, and we are very excited to have them. Becky Armbruster is a housing advocate with solid ground. Faith Simonelli is the Fair Housing and Housing Program Manager with Volunteers of America, Western Washington Dispute Resolution Center. And Jason Simon is the Fair Housing Counselor, also with the VOA Dispute Resolution Center. Just a few housekeeping items before we begin. So the webinar is 90 minutes, and we'll be sure to save about 20 minutes at the end for questions. You can submit a question anytime during the webinar by using the question function, which you can find in your GoToWebinar toolbar. Liza, Ann, and myself will read the questions as they come in, and then we'll ask as many as we can to our presenters at the end. Attendees should be muted automatically just because of the high turnout, but it's not because we don't want to hear from you. So if you need to communicate with us, please use the text function. Also, if you're calling into the webinar but didn't log on through the computer, make sure that your own phone is muted so we can eliminate as much background noise as possible. There is a short evaluation survey of the webinar that we will make available at the end. Good karma comes to those who fill out evaluation surveys, so please do. And then lastly, if you're interested in being part of a peer learning opportunity around working with landlords, there's a space at the end of the evaluation survey for you to indicate your interest. Okay, let's get started. Before handing it off to our presenters, here's just some brief context to the topic of working with private landlords and why it is critical to the success of a rapid rehousing program. Rapid rehousing, in its most boiled down form, is moving people who experience homelessness into their own permanent housing quickly. It's a simple concept, but one that represents a growing proportion of housing programs in the state. And so what this means is a growing reliance on landlords to rent to these families. So greater reliance on the private market has its opportunities and its challenges. Regarding housing programs, there are a limited number of housing vouchers like Section 8 vouchers or transitional housing units and low-income housing units, and wait times for these programs can be very long. Affordable housing is severely needed in many communities, and while these efforts continue, there are homeless families in crisis who can't wait months or years for openings. Time-limited housing programs can also have strict entry criteria that many families may not be able to meet. So in these three ways, there is greater potential to housing the most number of families most quickly in the private market. Some challenges to engaging with the private market can include low vacancy rates, high rent costs, and prejudiced landlords. So our presenters will share their best practices for addressing these and other challenges that they encounter. To help frame the discussion, and if this isn't new, to jog your collective memory, it's helpful to break down rapid rehousing into 4 primary phases. The first is coordinated entry and assessment, which is generally the front door of a homeless housing system and the point where families are found eligible and a good match for rapid rehousing. Next, the leasing up phase focuses on getting families into housing and may include supports like move-in cost subsidies, budgeting, and help with the housing search. Next is stabilizing in housing, which may include things like an ongoing rental subsidy, employment services, and conflict resolution. And then retaining, which is maintaining housing stability post-subsidy. So not everything happens all at once in rapid rehousing. There are different goals to each phase, and each family will need different levels and composition of support to reach those goals. But the takeaway here is we see that landlord connections, engagement, and relationship management are a common thread throughout a rapid rehousing life cycle. So in preparation for our first presenter, we want to center the conversation on the leasing up phase. So going forward, we would encourage providers and anyone else to think about these questions. What is our approach to the leasing up phase of rapid rehousing? Is it distinct from other components of the program? And if so, how? How is the program staffed? Are roles and skill sets divided within the agency or the team in order to maximize landlord engagement and retention? And finally, what are our leverage points with landlords, and how can we create more? So with that, food for thought, I will turn it over to our first presenter, Becky Armbruster.
Oh, hello, everybody. This is Becky. I'm just going to pull up my presentation here and get it going for you. So as Emily said, I'm a housing advocate at Solid Ground, and we're a nonprofit organization here in Seattle. And I'm sorry if any of this information I'm about to give you is repeat, or if you already know it or anything like that, but just kind of wanted to give you a little bit of what we do and how we approach rapid rehousing a little bit differently than maybe what you're used to or what your program does, or what you've heard from other people. So first of all, and I've added some photos to hopefully entertain you, little dogs. We work in a program called Journey Home, and we approach it a little bit differently. We split up the workload between case managers and housing advocates. So for the first step, case managers will get a referral for a family from our central intake system, which is Family Housing Connection in the Seattle area. Once we get the referral, the case manager makes contact with that family within the first 24 hours and does a full-blown assessment, probably what you're used to. What's going on here? All right. And then once that referral is finished, then we, the housing advocates, get a referral from the case manager for housing search. So we split up the work.
Becky?
Oh, yeah?
We had a request. Could you speak a little louder, please?
A little louder? Yeah, let me turn up my phone a little bit. Is that helpful at all?
Yeah, maybe just get as close as you can to the speaker.
Okay, perfect.
Great,
okay.
Thank you.
Yeah. So once the housing advocates get the referral, which is me, we set up a time to do our own intake with the client. So when the case manager does the initial intake, they dive in a little bit of the housing piece, but we really get into it with the clients. We talk about their past housing history, what they want in housing, and all the basics that you can go over with them. Housing advocates were also responsible for the inspections of the units. We do the check requests. We do letters to landlords. We do the monthly subsidy process with the program assistant. And of course, we do the advocating for our clients with landlords about the barriers that they face and the strengths they have, and how rapid rehousing will help them maintain stability. Like everything else, the
Sorry,
program...
Becky, that thing keeps popping up.
I know, I was not doing this before. Okay, let's see. Keep my current scheme. Okay. So the pros of this program that we really think are stellar is we build a really large team around the clients. They have all the support that we could possibly give when they're trying to get into housing. They have the housing advocates that are working with landlords. They have their case manager that's working on them with any other barriers that they're facing, and of course the career navigator that's helping them realize their career goals. So it's a really nice big support that they're getting when they're trying to get into housing initially. And another thing that we really like about splitting up the work is the work with landlords themselves. Since the housing advocates are going out and meeting with landlords and making so much contact with landlords, they get to know us, they know our faces, they know our voices, and they can contact us directly at any time. So they know that we're going to be there for them, and don't show this message again, which is really nice for them. The cons, of course, it can get a little bit confusing for families when the work is split up. How I usually tell them is if you have any questions or concerns about housing, applications, landlord tenant law, call me and I can get you to the right person. If you have any questions about DSHS issues or child care, anything else, contact your case manager. So it can get a little bit confusing because it's also interwoven, but we try and work it out as best as possible. Another downfall is juggling everyone's schedules involved. Since there is the family, the housing advocate, the case manager, and the career navigator, it can be tough to all meet together. We do the best we can, but we just understand that it won't necessarily always happen. So just wanted to give you all a little bit of a background on how we split the work up and how it's beneficial for us. So we'll move on from there. Maybe we'll move on from there. There we go. All right. So I'm going to give you a little bit of the tips and the tricks that we use and just some reminders as well. King County is a very, very hot market right now. I hear different numbers all the time of what our vacancy rate is, but the most recent one I've heard was about 2%. So it's important to really kind of dive into this with your families and tell them how fast things work and how much work this is really going to take. So when we sit down with families initially, we talk about where would they like to live, what's important for them in a house or an apartment, and what's realistic. You know, how much are they comfortable spending once they get their income up and the subsidy's gone, and what's realistic for them in the areas that they want to live, because a lot of times they have to be really flexible on location because so many parts of King County are just really, really expensive. So we like to have that really concrete conversation about that. Another thing we tell clients is that we can't necessarily find housing for them, but we can find housing with them. Since it's such a tough market out there right now, it's a partnership that we have to do. I'll look for housing. I'll contact my former landlords that I've worked with, and they're looking for housing as well. So while they're doing their piece, we go to our little toolbox that we have on the side. So Journey Home has been around for a really long time. So what we first usually do is go to our regular landlords who might be a good fit for our clients. We kind of scroll through the list and see where things are, and then give those landlords a call to see if there are any vacancies. Typically, there's a wait list if there aren't vacancies, so we want to make sure that we get those clients on the wait list just in case it's something that could work out for them. Also, since we have been around for a long time, we'll get random phone calls from landlords all the time saying, hey, I've got a 2-bedroom unit in Kent. And of course, then we all sit down together and figure out if there are any clients that we have that would be a good fit for that property. A couple more concrete tricks that we use. When we first meet with clients, we give them a blank rental application. A lot of times it's been a really long time since someone has rented, and so the market works far differently than what they're used to. Or we get clients who have never rented before, and so a housing application is really foreign to them. But we feel that if they get a little bit of practice and already have all of this information in front of them when they go and look for housing, it's really helpful in getting things moving quicker. You know, a lot of time a rental application will even say, what's your former landlord's phone number, which will sometimes take some digging on clients' behalf to even have that information. Another thing we talk about is the possibility of a co-signer for clients. We've used it a couple times in the past, but a lot of times our clients don't have that kind of support structure around them to have somebody who will sign or co-sign on a lease with them. But if it's there, if someone has good credit and good income, then it's a nice opportunity for the clients to use. We also will give clients an actual script to approach landlords. It's pretty easy, but it can be intimidating for them to get on the phone and to talk to a landlord when it's been so long or if they've never done it before. So having a little script is nice for them to just have that visual tool and see, this is what I need to say when I call these landlords. And it helps them save time too when, if they're talking to a landlord who says they can have no evictions on their record and this client has evictions, then they can go off the script and say, what's your screening criteria? And then they don't have to go all the way out there and waste gas money and fill out an application just to get denied. So whatever we can do up front, we try to do, and just remind our clients that it's going to be a lot of work no matter what for both of us. So another thing we talk about is the flexibility of lease. We talk to landlords about that, and we talk to clients about that. If clients are facing a lot of barriers, if they have a couple evictions and maybe $385 in income at the time, we can talk to them about maybe getting a 3-month lease and seeing how it goes. And if it doesn't work out, then they won't necessarily be stuck in a lease and have an eviction on their record if things go south. And then I also want to point out that family strengths are some of our greatest tools that we use in engaging with landlords and clients alike. A lot of times they've only heard about what their barriers are, your credit stat, you have criminal history, but it's up to us to remind them of what they can do. And it sounds a little bit weird, but sometimes you can even use their barriers as strengths. For example, a lot of our clients have theft and or forgery on their criminal backgrounds, but it's up to us to really tease out that story from them. And a lot of times we'll say, hey, tell me about this this forgery felony on your credit, and they'll say, well, I was trying to buy my kids' school clothes, and I had no money, and it was out of desperation. So we know that with this story, landlords won't necessarily rent to our clients, but it puts things into perspective for them. And it lets clients know, like, yeah, it was a crime, but you're trying to be a good parent and look out for your kids. So being able to connect that with them can be really useful. Another thing I would like to remind everybody of is rapid isn't always quick. We, as case managers and housing advocates, we kind of get caught up in this. We want to get people housed quickly, and we want to see them successful, but just the reality of it is the market's really tough. So we really stress to clients that everybody moves at a different pace. Sometimes it takes people a week to get housed. Sometimes it takes them 6 months. But just because it isn't rapid doesn't mean we aren't going to be successful. So we really like to drive that home with our clients. And of course, lastly, don't ever underestimate the power of luck. A lot of times, I'll come to my office in the morning and I'll have a landlord email me that says, hey, I have this perfect 2-bedroom for this client that's been looking for 2 months, and I can just really breeze them in. So I know it's not a perfect solution, but it happens enough that I thought it was important to talk about. So, moving on from here. I wanted to talk to you about a couple types of landlords. Of course, we have a private owner, and we have properties that are run by property management companies or real estate agencies. Of course, if we have clients who have barriers at all, we tell them, look for a private owner. They have the ability to be flexible on their screening criteria, and you can really tell them your story, and they're the ones making the decision, not anyone else above them. But also comes along with that, clients ask me, well, how do I know what's a private landlord? So I saved a couple of Craigslist listings on here that will hopefully work when I pull them up. Here we go. So this is obviously very expensive property, which I would never send a client to, but it was a good example of what a private landlord will put up as a listing on Craigslist. Hopefully you can kind of see this top photo. It's just of an unmade bed. The photos they're nice, but they're not perfect. And then you scroll through, and this is a very, very long listing. But she talks about my property and if this works for you, you will send me your rent checks and I communicate with my tenants. So looking for a lot of those like I languages of this is my property, et cetera, et cetera. There's usually a name attached to it. I don't know if you guys can see down here, but it says, very sincerely, thank you, Kathy. Private landlords will often leave their name, phone number, and email on a Craigslist ad. And this is just the most common way that people are posting listings for units these days. So this is one example of a private landlord of something that might look like what they would put up on the internet. And then for a property management company, these will probably look familiar to you as well. The photos are more professional. You can see that this one, it's been staged. Someone's come in. They're pretty formatted listings normally. It will even say managed by. This one says Holland Residential. They'll have office hours that's usually attached with larger properties that are run by property management companies. And I believe that this one has an open house on here, which I won't ever necessarily send anyone to an open house because the competition is usually pretty stiff unless you're the very first person there. So you want to look for the key indications that this is a property management company. And like I said, if your client has a lot of barriers, it will be much tougher to get them into a property like this than a private landlord. So hopefully those were helpful to you all. So here's some tricks for landlord engagement and what we have found helpful at Journey Home over the past few years. So like I said, like I'll probably say again, the market is just insane here right now. I'll give clients listings. Say I'll give a client a listing today, and if they wait tomorrow to call, the listing is gone. The property's been rented. It's going so quickly that we've really had to tailor some of these tools really to make it work for us. But speed, first of all, is really has been our friend. We build a lot of flexible time into our schedules as housing advocates because we literally have to drop what we're doing sometimes and run money across the county. If the client submits an application, a landlord typically won't hold that application or the unit for a client until they have money in their hand. So we worked it out with our finance department where we can get petty cash for an application fee or two and get a money order and race it out to the landlord or property manager. And that way they can see our face and have the money in hand, and we can give them some more information on the program. If the fees that are associated with the initial application, a lot of times there will be administrative fees. Our finance department can cut a check in literally less than a day. So I can have a check request at 10 a.m., put it in, and have the check at 2:30 and bring it out to the landlord. It has saved so many of our clients' butts before. I can't even stress it enough. But also a lot of times properties that are familiar with us, they will accept a pledge letter or promissory note to hold the unit until the next day. But we're trying so hard to get so many new landlords all the time that they're becoming less and less familiar with us. So speed is key. Another key factor in housing families with landlords quickly is money. And I know that some programs have less money than others, but this has just been a way that it's really worked for us in a market that's landlord-driven. When we have clients that have zero income or limited income, just receiving TANF, the flexibility of rapid rehousing and money that comes with it has been amazing. A lot of times I'll ask a landlord with these specific families, what would it take for you to rent to my client? And, you know, sometimes they'll kind of laugh and say, oh, you know, 2 months guaranteed rent. And I'll say, okay, let me talk to my boss and I'll call you back. So I can take that to my boss and she can get the approval and I can take it back to that landlord and say, yeah, let me give you 2 months rent. Will you rent to my client? So I think it's a little bit surprising for landlords, and they've never seen this kind of program before who's able to do that. So it's really, really nice. And then reassurance for landlords is, it also sounds kind of silly and a little bit used car salesman-y, but it's so important to build the relationship and reassure landlords that you're here and you'll be here for them. Even if you know that they're not going to rent to you, even if it's just a cold call from someone on Craigslist, it's important to build that relationship. I had a landlord recently who I talked to who I knew from the beginning that he was not going to rent to my client because he had a bad experience with Section 8. But he ended up talking to me for a half an hour about what he had gone through and what he experienced, and just having that ear to listen. I added him on my landlord list because even though he wasn't willing to rent to my landlord now, I might call him a couple months down the road and tell him that we had talked and I wanted to talk to him more about his experience and see if I could really, build that relationship and have him rent to our families. The next little item is what I like to call the carrot. So Emily had kind of touched on this a little bit, and we're working on a little bit more strategies around this, but what is the landlord getting from renting to your client? Yeah, they are getting this good feeling that they're helping house a homeless family, but what else? They are taking a chance if a family has an eviction or criminal history. And in these circumstances, we often connect them with the Landlord Liaison Project. And I'm not sure who all out there has Landlord Liaison projects set up in your community, but it might be something you want to, start talking about, or other different ways that you might be able to implement something like LLP. Because for landlords who really understand the benefits, they're the only thing that we need to get our clients into housing. They're able to provide landlord tenant mediation. They have a 24-hour hotline and a risk reduction fund for clients who potentially will get evicted or have more damages when they leave the unit than the security deposit covers. So LLP is great. They've also been able to make some connections with larger property management companies, those big companies who have a very strict screening criteria. LLP has been able to partner with some of them and get them to make their screening criteria far more flexible. It's been really, really, really helpful. And lastly, face-to-face interactions. One of the first things I tell clients is that it's harder for a landlord to say no to your face than it is over the phone. So if I find a landlord, or if a client finds a landlord who seems like maybe they'll rent to my client, I will go with the client to the walkthrough of the unit, give them the rundown of the program and how it works, what we can offer, have the client bring all of the support that they have, because, like I said, it's harder for that landlord to say no to our face than it is over the phone. And lastly, landlord retention. We all know that this program is not going to work for all of our families. We know that there will be some evictions. We know that there will be some landlords who are upset with us, and that's just kind of the way things go sometimes. But being available to these landlords and maintaining that relationship is really, really key. Even if your client has exited 3 months ago and you haven't heard from them, and suddenly a landlord calls you and said that they haven't paid their rent. It is vital for you to pick up the phone, call the client, even if you can't get a hold of them, leave them a message and call the landlord back and say, you know what, I'm trying to see if I can get them to re-engage. And a lot of times landlords will know too, even if you aren't able to provide, eviction prevention funds or any other funds towards the unit, they just want to hear that you're trying. It's happened a lot with me. If I have a client get evicted, I can go, and I've interacted with this landlord, I can go back a few months later and say, hey, I have another client. And since they know that I was at least here, they'll usually re-rent to me, which is really, really, really great. Also, throwing breakfasts and events for landlords who have rented to your clients is also fun, but really nice just to say thank you. The county right now is working on a couple of events to engage landlords and give them a thank you. I know someone from Catholic Community Services, Amelia, I don't know if you're out there, but she had told me that she would send thank you notes to every single landlord that she talked to, which I thought was a great approach. And lastly, re-engage with landlords. If you do have a client who got evicted from a unit, don't feel like you need to take that landlord off of your master landlord. Maybe give it some time if they were really upset, if something very, very bad went wrong. But a year from now, give them a call again. Let them know what's changed. Let them know what's different about the family that will be renting from them this time, and see if they're willing to come back. So that's pretty much it. Lastly, I wanted to leave y'all with some sites that are useful for us in our housing search with clients. Craigslist is the obvious one. PadMapper is a good site. It's just much cleaner than Craigslist, but it pulls in some listings from Craigslist and other housing search sites. Housing Search Northwest is good. Section 8 started that website, so the landlords who list there are familiar with subsidy kind of programs. Apartmentfinder.org, rentals.com, and of course the support systems that families already have in place. If they have a cousin or an aunt or an uncle or someone who owns the property who is willing to rent them a room or anything, then that's really, really a good place to go as well. So that's pretty much all I have for you guys, and hopefully it was helpful. But I'll stick around for questions.
Thank you, Becky. And thanks to everyone who submitted questions. We will toss those to Becky at the end to the Q&A, and a reminder that you can, if you have a question for Becky, you can submit it at any time. So we heard from Becky about her best practices to getting families into housing with landlords, and now to hear about how to help families stay there are Faith and Jason. So take it away.
Hello, my name is Faith Simonelli. I'm with Volunteers of America, Western Washington Dispute Resolution Center, and I'm sitting here with Jason Simon, our Fair Housing Counselor. Just to give you a little history about us, we are a mediation center based out of Snohomish County, but we also service Skagit and Island County. We've had a landlord-tenant engagement phone line for the last 32 years. Actually, that's how we started in our community, and we've slowly broadened out into other areas. Since we are a mediation center, we've commonly done mediations between landlords and tenants. We represent, and not represent, but we mediate in small claims court along with in-house, and we do a lot of conciliations. But I just wanted to give you a little bit of history about us, and then moving on. So as you probably realize, conflict is a natural concept that we both have. We have both different types of conflict, constructive and destructive. So keeping that in regards to when we're engaging within landlords is how you'll realize what we are at through a mediation center as we're looking through that common ground. We currently here in Snohomish County work with all of the nonprofits that work with housing and transitional housing and rapid rehousing programs along with our current Snohomish County navigators. So we're constantly getting calls in regards to how can we help bridge the concepts between conflict and what a landlord's facing and what a current tenant is facing. So that is really how we try to focus in on. Our scope of work that we currently have is dispute resolution, information, education, and resources in regards to our fair housing and housing facilities. We also contain bilingual services, so we are able to communicate with some of our local Hispanic community, and then we're also bringing on someone that is Russian. So shelter is a basic need, and that's something that I think that as a concept we all have to consider. We need to appreciate that inherent power dynamics between the landlord and the tenant. The landlord has an asset that they're trying to protect, and the tenant has something that they have to offer, and that is consistent payment. So looking at the landlord-tenant relationship as a business practice and not as a personal one is something that we have found with landlords. If we're able to go to them from a neutral standpoint, that they've been extremely receptive on. Identifying that and in explaining to our clients that rent payments equal mortgage payments for our landlords is something that's really kind of an innate possibility and an innate relationship that they have. And that typical repairs would equal fewer expensive, more larger repairs in the future for our landlords. We also try and explain to our clients and those that we're working with through our landlord-tenant renter certification training and understanding the terms and the conditions of what they're agreeing to, and then also documenting everything in writing, whether it be repairs or communications. And I think it was really brought up in with the last presenter how important it is to have that verbal relationship with your landlord and to provide that and start that healthy relationship from the get-go of the relationship. So it's harder, like was said earlier, it's harder for them to refuse you housing in person rather than over the phone, but also taking into consideration of guiding your clients through what nonverbal relationships they're also extenuating into the landlord's relationship. So making sure that they have a handshake, eye contact, that true coaching is what's really going to be breaking them into possibly finding housing. Also, along with the verbal nature, the feeling statements, the open-ended questions if they have those, and then also increasing the writing relationship that they have with their landlord and make sure that the communication is not just paper, email, or text, but that is also in person so that they're helping build and create those long-standing relationships. So some of the factors that you need to consider is that we do have an RCW here for the state of Washington. It's the Residential Landlord Tenant Act, RCW 59.18. It explains the rights, the expectations, and the responsibilities for both the landlord and the tenant. It is a 52-page act. It has a lot of legal language in it. But it is definitely worth, if you're working in that environment, for you to print off and to become associated with. There is, as we try and put it, knowledge is power. So as we're working with clients throughout our county, Snohomish County, we're trying to instill in them, whether it be landlords or tenants, that their knowledge base on what their rights are is extremely powerful as how they convey themselves. It's amazing when we're working with a client and we've given them a little bit of information and how they're able to utilize that, and you really see them kind of like stand up a little straighter, talk a little bit more profound, and that they are the experts of their own knowledge. The more landlords and tenants know, the easier it is for both of them to hold each other accountable, whether it be with repairs or when rent is actually due. There isn't an enforcement agency in the state of Washington for the Landlord Tenant Act. So it's kind of that's where the advocacy can really come into play. But it's also why it's important to also have the neutral parties there. So one of the things that we do is we become that neutral party. We are not for the landlord and we are not for the tenant. In fact, if we were to take sides on either party, we'd be letting them both down. So that is really where a local mediation center could really come into play to try and bring both parties into that, to try and eliminate evictions being filed, repairs to be done, and any of those things that are not being held accountable through the Landlord Tenant Act. It's extremely actually imperative that movement kind of like moves through and that you're able to bring both parties there, because without that open communication, it's going to be difficult for you to have anything done. So as a part of the Landlord Tenant Act, it talks about the different types of notices, the noncompliance with written notice and legal action. We have the 3-day pay or vacate and the 10-day comply or vacate that you'll notice is on your screen. Now, the vacate portion of that is really discerning. If your client is in a yearly lease, there really isn't a vacate possibility unless they have a signed agreement with their current landlord that says that they're doing a mutual end of tenancy, or they're mutually agreeing to end the tenancy, because they're still obligated for the amount of the lease term on their lease. So reading their lease is going to be extremely, extremely important. We also have the 20-day end of tenancy. So if one of your clients is on a month-to-month, it's going to be extremely imperative that they understand that either party can give the written notification to end the tenancy. And I don't know about anyone else out there, but 20 days to try and find a tenant proper housing if they're working with someone that has a disability is a little bit difficult. And what we have found is it's extremely difficult. So I just want to put that out there, that it's extremely important that you take that into consideration, that if you're working with clients that are on a month-to-month, that the landlord can only give your tenant 20 days written notification from the end of their lease term that they have to be out on. Moving forward, evictions are expensive. They're expensive for the landlord, and they're extremely costly for the tenant. The costs that are incurred for the landlord in Snohomish County, I've been told, is roughly about $1,500 to $1,700 just for the filing of the eviction, and then, of course, their unit is vacant. The cost for the tenant is, as we know, exiting out of homelessness is a costly thing, not just for our shelters, but also for the individuals that are doing it. And then it's also the future housing cost that's going to evolve. Once you have an eviction on your record in the state of Washington, it doesn't leave unless you've had a special document that says that you've paid it off, filed with the courts, and that's it. So taking that into consideration, it's sometimes very difficult later on down the line to get someone that's had an eviction. So our whole point is to not even have the eviction filed, that we're working with individuals to keep that proper relationship in place prior to them possibly exiting out. Through our phone line, we do phone conciliations, and we have both the landlord and the tenant agree to a proper date to have them exit out. So there's no conflict, that the tenant is very clear as to what the expectation is, that they're leaving the tenancy of the apartment clean and orderly, and that the landlord is not going to be filing the eviction. We do everything in our power to not have that be filed. We do not have a nominal amount that we can pay for eviction strategies, but what we have is that we're working with the landlord and with the tenant to try and reach that good. So negotiating the shared interest. So we renegotiate the payment plan, what that would look like, the time frame of what that would be, and then also we talk with the tenant as to where they could possibly move to try and not have that eviction evolve. And I'm going to now turn it over to Jason Simons, our Fair Housing Counselor for Snohomish County, to cover the fair housing perspective of it all.
Thank you so much. My name is Jason again, and I am the Fair Housing Counselor. And what exactly does that mean? So I meet with clients, I meet with tenants, advocates, and even speak with landlords from time to time to kind of help them problem solve possible next steps given whatever their situation may be. And some of the tenants I speak with have not only a fair housing component, which I'll speak to in a moment, but also the landlord and tenant as well. And so they're trying to balance the two scenarios of the two sets of laws and trying to figure out where they want to lead first. That's kind of my role. So what is fair housing? Fair housing is the right of all people to be free from discrimination in the rental, sale, or financing of housing. So that's what fair housing is. There is a Washington State law against discrimination. There's Title VI of the Civil Rights Act of '64, and also Title VIII of the Civil Rights Act of 1968. There's also additional laws that do come into play as well. And there's other cities that have specific ordinances or jurisdictional things that are very different as well. So what does this mean? What are elements of unlawful discrimination? So one is being a member of a protected class. The other part is adverse housing action or practice, and then a relationship between the two. So there are federal and state protected classes. So what it means is unlawful discrimination, or that the possibility of that happening takes place when someone feels that they're being treated specifically different because of a protected class, right? So that's where it comes into play. So tenants will call and they'll say, for example, I feel like I'm being treated differently because I have children, or because I have a service animal, or because of my ancestries, right? And so we'll meet with the client and talk about the feelings that that person's having, his or her experiences, and discussing what possible next steps there are. So what are those federal and statewide protected classes? It's sex, it's race, it's color, disability, marital status, familial status, religion, creed, national origin, ancestry, veteran and military status, sexual orientation, and gender identity. So those are the federal and state. There are additional classes that are protected in, for example, political ideologies covered in the city of Seattle. Section 8 is also covered in certain areas such as the city of Seattle, Bellevue, Kirkland, Redmond, unincorporated King County. Where I work myself in Snohomish County, Section 8 isn't protected in the same way. So the ones we hear a lot of, get a lot of phone calls from ourselves in this office, tend to be disability. That's probably the most common. We do get some familial status ones as well, and I'll speak a little more to that as well. The other note I have in here is association. So association isn't a protected class per se, but let's say a tenant has somebody over in the unit who practices religion XYZ, and the landlord starts to not do the maintenance on that unit anymore, and the tenant feels it's because of their friends, right, because of their friend who they bring over. So at times, association with somebody who is protected can come into play as well. So what types of unlawful discrimination are there? Specific intent, right? Those are things like advertisements. We do not rent to family with children, for example. Or written correspondence, right? Some documentation that really is laying out the situation. Different treatment, failure to rent, maybe unequal maintenance, right? Maybe the landlord is attending to some tenants who have maintenance issues quite efficiently, but maybe not another one, and that tenant feels it's because of their protected class. So that's an example. Another one is housing policies. Where I see that, where we're getting the most phone calls with that is familial status. For example, a lease says children cannot ride bikes in the hallway, right? So it's targeting children rather than just saying bikes are not permitted to be, used in the hallway, for example. So they're very specifically targeting a protected class. Sometimes the landlord does not intend to, right? And it's just habit, for example. And sometimes the policies appear neutral, right? But maybe they're not. So that's where that comes in. Harassment is another type. Severe, pervasive sexual harassment, for example, can come into play. The ones we get here at the Dispute Resolution Center, the most phone calls about are probably reasonable accommodations and reasonable modifications. So definitely getting some phone calls about service animals, for example, grab bars, right? The landlord saying, I'm not willing to do the grab bar, or saying the insurance company won't allow us to. So what's typical is that there's an interactive process between the landlord and tenant when those requests are made, whether they're verbally or in writing. So those are some things that come up. Also, retaliation can come into play. So let's say the tenant files a complaint with the Human Rights Commission. So ourselves here, we don't do enforcement or investigations per se. We really are trying to help tenants figure out what steps they want to take. And some of those steps are just letting us know their experience. Some of those steps may be literally reaching out to the landlord and providing them with information so they better appreciate those rights in the future. But retaliation can happen. Let's say it gets filed, right? Someone files with the Washington State Human Rights Commission per se, and let's say they're not able to find cause, right? They're not able to identify it, but then the landlord turns around and retaliates. So maybe the tenant moves out, and a couple months later, they find out that the previous landlord is giving a reference that says, don't rent to this tenant because they filed a complaint, at my property. So that's where retaliation comes into play. So again, what sort of violations do we hear, right, at the Dispute Resolution Center? The common one is service animal. And what's interesting with service animals, emotional support animals, assistance animals, is what I'm hearing from tenants, what they're saying is the landlord is saying, I don't have any protection if the dog causes damage, for example. And this is where it starts to intersect with Landlord Tenant, because the Landlord Tenant Act says the landlord cannot charge above normal wear and tear, but certainly can charge for damages. So sometimes what happens is the landlord is trying to, it doesn't, I would say, acknowledge those protections in the Landlord Tenant Act, and so they inadvertently decide not to accommodate, right? And so the service animals, the standard is a request is made. The landlord may request for some sort of documentation. The standard is a letter, right, with vouching from a doctor, a professional, or whatnot, that says that this is a disability-related need, and that's good to go. We get phone calls, for example, where the landlord is accepting the service animal or the emotional assistance animal, but is trying to charge for a pet deposit, right? And so in that case, service animals are not considered pets. And so a lot of it is better understanding what rights and responsibilities are come into play. The other one is families with children. Definitely getting some phone calls with policies in place or swimming pool issues, right? Adult-only swim times can be problematic as well. And in those cases, it seems like, or from the tenant's point of view, what I'm hearing is maybe the landlord doesn't really realize how it's coming out and how they're directing these things towards children. ESL, we do have bilingual services here as well. So we certainly hear from tenants who feel like they're getting charged different rates because of their national origin, for example, or their primary language, or issues with deposits. We are getting those. And again, tenants vary on what they want to do, right? Sometimes they just want us to know what's going on, and sometimes we'll engage with the landlord and talk about, the pet fee, for example. And some tenants want to take that next step and file the complaint, right, to have an investigation done. So it kind of varies tenant to tenant. It seems part of the decisions, it seems, that tenants make on whether or not they file the complaint are related to, are they in a month-to-month lease or in a year lease, right? They have a certain amount of time to file, which is 1 year. So sometimes their immediate need to maintain the shelter comes into play of whether they are at that point comfortable of filing a complaint. So it certainly varies. Here's another example. So where evictions or notices come in play with fair housing. So let's say a tenant gets a 10-day comply or vacate, right? The tenant is having a hard time to demonstrate that they're in compliance with it, right? The landlord files the unlawful detainer action in court, and the landlord feels like other neighbors aren't getting 10-day comply or vacates because of this perceived, so what happens is, right, there's a court filing for this eviction, while simultaneously the tenant may be filing with the Washington State Human Rights Commission or the Housing and Urban Development. So sometimes there can be two things going on, something in the local court, right, while at the same time an investigation is coming into play. And so these are kind of things landlord or tenants are trying to sort out as one to take that next step. Other ones we hear are, for example, a tenant has a month-to-month lease, right, and so they get a 20-day notice. And a couple days before the end of that month, the tenant calls and says, you know what, I have this disability, I'm having a really difficult time getting housing, I really want to be able to stay in the property for a while longer. Well, some tenants request a reasonable accommodation, for example, and maybe the landlord is going to comply or not comply. either way, we can go ahead and reach out to the landlord and have a conversation from an impartial point of view, right? The tenant has called us. He or she is interested in staying in the unit a little longer. Is this an opportunity? Is there an opportunity for this to happen? So where some tenants may choose to simply, make that official accommodation request, right? Whether in writing or not, sometimes they want us to intervene and really come from an impartial point of view to kind of problem solve it. So there's different ways we fit in. What makes us unique is we are impartial, and we will engage in landlord-tenant issues and fair housing issues in the sense of trying to help problem solve in the moment, right? And we'll meet people at coffee shops, for example, various places, really whatever the tenant is looking for. So again, we offer information, right? We do a lot of education, and we do counseling, which is kind of like fair housing filtering, you might say. The other thing we do is in our renter certification trainings, about half of it has a fair housing component as well. We also, in partnership with the Washington State Human Rights Commission, put on fair housing workshops that are explicitly fair housing. And so those are kind of the things that we're always working on. So there's other organizations clearly in the state in this space as well. There's other nonprofits such as the Northwest Fair Housing Alliance, Fair Housing Center of Washington, and those are nonprofits doing different roles. Just for example, Fair Housing Center of Washington will do fair housing planning, fair housing testing, for example, and then there's organizations like the Housing Urban Development, State Human Rights Commission. There's ordinance-specific organizations like the King County Office of Civil Rights, Seattle Office for Civil Rights, Tacoma Human Rights, and they play the enforcement part. And sometimes when complaints get filed, they're getting filed kind of with the Housing Urban Development, Washington State Human Rights Commission, maybe with one of the other local, ordinance locations as well. So it kind of depends. And so there we go. I look forward to the questions that are soon to come. Thank you.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Faith. So here are a couple more Here we go. Here are a couple more websites with resources to HUD's fair housing laws, fair housing resources for housing providers, courtesy of King County, which includes some very accessible information about fair housing in Washington State, not just for King County. And then the website for the Northwest Justice Project, which is Washington's public legal aid program. And they operate CLEAR, which is a toll-free intake and referral hotline. And CLEAR, so people know, it's an acronym for Coordinated Legal Education, Advice, and Referral. Okay, so we have about 20 minutes for questions. Thank you to everyone who submitted them. We've read them all, and they are excellent, and we'll get to as many as we can. And if we don't get to your question today, we will follow up with you directly. So our first question is for Jason and Faith about discrimination regarding felons. Is that a protected class?
That's a good question. We get, it is not. It is not. Criminal background, right? Having a criminal background is not a protected class. And this gets back into landlord tenant as well. So we can certainly, there are certain felonies that seem to come more into play, that become more of a barrier to housing per se. But in and of itself, right, having a criminal background is not protected in that sense. There has been conversations, there's the difference between arrests and felonies, right? So there has been conversations and discussions about certain demographics having more of those experiences in play and how that comes into play with fair housing, right? But with landlord tenants specifically, we certainly do talk to tenants about certain barriers to housing and the steps tenants can take to make those past criminal background issues less of a barrier And sometimes it's gathering documentation, identifying all the steps he or she has taken to put that in the past.
Right, and I would also like to emphasize it from piggybacking on what Becky had said in the earlier presentation, it's really finding out the cause and effect behind the felony to see where the personal growth has been. And if it was due to a mental illness, even though the felony itself is not, their act is not, criminal background is not a protected class, maybe they have another protected class that we need to be aware of when we're working with them or trying to help them communicate with landlords.
Sure.
Thank you. And then another follow-up question to that is there anywhere where wear and tear is legally defined that you know of?
The Landlord Tenant Act says that it is light treading on the carpet, so no. Unfortunately, I wish it was a lot more specific. But what we recommend in our training is that individuals take pictures before they move in and after they move out, and that they take pictures of the hot water tank, the bathrooms, underneath the sink, because that's really what they're able to do is to show the wear and tear prior to them moving in, and then also be very specific in their checklist when they're moving through. And if they're not provided a checklist, that doesn't mean that they cannot do one on their own. That's another thing. They can still do a checklist when the landlord is not present, and then present it to the landlord upon moving in.
The other thing with that is ask the landlord, when was the carpet last replaced? You know, when was the room last painted? Note that on the inspection checklist, and that could come into play later.
Hi, this is another one for Jason and Faith. This actually comes, so some of our housing providers are also landlords, so this is sort of from the perspective of being a landlord.
Yeah.
Which is what happens when a tenant gives their 20-day notice, and then the landlord already has a new tenant, got a new deposit, but then that original tenant pulls back and says, actually, we don't, sort of that example you gave before.
Yeah.
You know, what's the landlord-tenant implication of the law?
I can't really speak on what the law states, because the law states that when someone is given a 20-day notice, that upon the end of that 20 days, they're expected to be out. The key element that I would like to say is that to come from a facilitative, neutral standpoint, to find out what's the barrier that's getting in the way of them moving out. That would be first and foremost. Now, when it comes down to the grind, that tenant is expected to be out come the first of the month. And unfortunately, the landlord is being put in a perspective that they have two choices. They can try and facilitate, well, I have three actually, facilitate the conversation themselves. They can call and see if a mediation center can communicate with the tenant, or they can start the eviction process because that was the agreement that they were supposed to be out. And they can make that known. Now, I would hope that no one would go directly to the eviction process, because that's a larger barrier in the long term for the tenant. But those are kind of the three basic approaches that a landlord can take when a tenant is reneging on a 20-day.
Great, thank you. So Becky, this is a question for you, kind of merging these two topics. So in your role as a housing advocate, do you see fair housing violations, and then how do you deal with that?
Yes, we do see fair housing violations, and kind of depending on what it is, you know, we'll set families up with. We have a landlord-tenant hotline here who they can contact them directly, because we have to say, you know, we're not lawyers on this subject matter, so you know, call the landlord-tenant hotline. I had another client who was pretty blatantly racially discriminated against. So I set her up with the Office of Civil Rights, and they're, I'm not sure what sort of follow-up she's done with them, but they were sort of starting to get involved. So yeah, there's some stuff that we see from time to time, but we typically will give them additional resources to get moving on what they want to do.
Great. And then also another question for you, Becky. Given the possibility of a 20-day notice risk that Faith and Jason talked about, how do you go about negotiating leases? And if you try for 6 months versus 12 months or month to month, given that risk of, eviction notices that move really quickly?
Yeah, that also kind of depends. I typically, I give the client their options of what they can do. If you want a year lease, you're locked in. Your landlord's not going to raise your rent at all in that year. Same for 6 months, same for 3 months. But I always just inform them that if they do get into a month-to-month lease, then that possibility of getting a rent increase is there, or giving a 20-day notice to vacate or something like that. So I really leave it up to the clients of what they feel most comfortable with. And then if we find a landlord who is really only willing to do that 3-month lease with the client, then we just really have an in-depth discussion about it. How do you feel about it? Do you want to move forward? What's nice is that they can say no if they're not comfortable with it. But other times, I remember one time specifically, I had a landlord who said that they would only do a month-to-month lease. And I said, well, are you willing to sign a document that says you won't raise this rent within 6 months? And she said, yeah, okay. And she just signed off on it. And that was 10 months ago, and she hasn't raised the rent at all. So I just like to have that extra little protection on having a signed document from the landlord that says, we understand it's month to month, but we have no intentions of raising the rent. So I kind of do whatever I need to in the moment to make it work.
Great, thank you. And then, Becky, another question for you. Actually, quite a few came in about this. Is if you could give an example, if you have an example of a script that you use with clients, and if you also have something that you could send out, maybe send to us, and then we could share with the attendees later. But if you, off the top of your head, or had an example of what kind of script you practice with clients before they go talk to landlords.
Yeah, totally. Sometimes I'll do a little mock, sort of like a mock interview, and I'll play the landlord and the client can play the prospective tenant. I'll do that face-to-face with them. If they're not comfortable with that, then the script I give them is pretty simple. And it's mostly just to get people going, but it says, and of course I'll send it to everybody as well. It says, hi, I'm calling about the unit that you had listed, then a couple follow-up questions with that, and then I just want to know what the screening criteria is, and then a couple follow-up questions with that, and then, are you familiar with solid ground? They may or may not ask that question, but, and then just kind of go from there. I usually use it for clients to make sure that they're not wasting their time on properties that wouldn't accept them with their barriers, to see what that screening criteria is up front and if it's flexible or not. So yeah, I'll happily send something over to you, Emily, and you can get it out to everybody.
Thanks. Yeah, we'll do that. We'll send it as part of our follow-up email and make it available on our website.
Perfect.
And this next question was about my introduction in the beginning, talking about the overall rapid rehousing process, and if at that front door of coordinated entry and assessment, if families are assessed for rapid rehousing. And just to clarify that, so coordinated entry is sometimes called coordinated entry or centralized intake or coordinated entry and assessment. So really what that means is at that front door is really the eligibility screen. So the question is if the core tenets of rapid rehousing include that people are not screened out for rapid rehousing, and that's true. So it's really an eligibility screen, meaning are they literally homeless? and you know, it's very, very low barrier. So just to clarify that point.
And I've got another question that came in, and this can be for any of the panelists, because I think there's different perspectives on it, or ways that it can be done in practice. But it is, what are your thoughts on non-refundable deposits in the lease, as that can obviously present a barrier, and it can actually be half of the deposit, half of the overall deposit. And so thinking of it both from like sort of the legal standpoint, but also from the practice standpoint. Do you veer people away from it? Is there anything like that?
Well, I think that I'm going to jump in and answer this a little bit. And in the RCW 59.18, it says that all deposits are supposed to have the aspect of being refundable. So fees, if they're listed on the lease as being a fee, they are considered to be absolutely non-refundable. That's a fee, that's a cleaning fee or a pet fee. That's money that you as a tenant are directly giving to the landlord. Now, in regards to, I have seen in the past couple of years this trend on leases where landlords will have the deposits broken down as being this portion is refundable, this portion is supposed to be non-refundable. But if they go back to the RCW does state that that deposits are supposed to have, all aspects of our deposit are supposed to be refundable compared to what it states. Now, what people will argue and what we've heard is being stated is that some individuals will say you're signing a contract, and because you're signing a contract, you're agreeing to these things. And I think that you're going to have to find legal counsel to actually determine on if that's the case or not. But if you're talking about just landlord tenant and the RCW states that it's that all deposits have the prospect of being refundable. Hopefully that helps answer the question.
Yeah, and I'll jump in on that too. From a harm reduction standpoint, we as housing advocates, we have landlords sign off on basically a breakdown of costs that we send up to our finance department to get approved. And on there it says security deposit, what's refundable and what's not refundable. And if it says, you know, half of the deposit is a fee or whatever, so there's only a $250 remaining refundable security deposit, typically I will offer an increased deposit just because whatever's left over from the deposit goes back to the client, and I want them to be set up to move into another apartment without having additional damage or additional costs from maybe damages or anything like that. So the $250 refundable deposit isn't going to get them very far if there's any sort of damages at all. So that's when I would ask the landlord if they would accept an increased deposit just to protect the client.
Right. I would also like to add that one of the trends that we're seeing in our local community with landlords is that they will have a part of the lease be an itemized sheet that'll have it broken down. This is how much we charge for painting. This is how much we charge for the wear and tear on your carpet. This is how much. It's kind of like a standard. So as anyone working with a client, quickly do the math and make sure that the deposit you're paying is covering what they're agreeing to. Because the trend that we're currently seeing is that clients are moving in and they're agreeing to whatever's in the lease and they're not reading it thoroughly, and they're actually agreeing to paying the landlord upon move out. So the fees for wear and tear and everything that they've agreed to is already more than what they've paid for any deposit. So I like the concept of an increased deposit rather than having it broken down, and to try and do that active negotiation with them.
Great, thank you. Becky, this question is for you. What percentage of placements are successful, and how long does it take on average to find housing with a client?
Oh, I don't really know, to be honest with you. I would have to have our program assistant pull those kinds of numbers, but and Also, I should mention that we have the pilot rapid rehousing program, and we have another funding source that acts as a separate rapid rehousing program, and we can take direct referrals to move-in families who have Section 8. So the numbers are a little bit tricky on that because some people have a little bit more of an advantage, I should say, if they have a Section 8 voucher. It typically takes them less time to move into places. But I will say that over the last couple of years, the time that it's taken from intake to move-in has increased. But only, I mean, I definitely blame the market for that. Everybody wants to live in King County, and landlords know that. So they're raising their rents, and the competition's fierce. So I can't really exactly answer that, the move-in times. And then since I guess, retention on people who are still in rapid rehousing and being successful and paying their rent, it also varies. Because the program is flexible, those families who have already at their 3 months and who are running into issues, we're still doing accommodations for and continuing to pay their rent. The last couple of families in the pilot that I could think of who have exited are definitely still paying their rent on time and are still in housing. So sorry I can't give you exact numbers, but it's looking like it's taking longer, and retention is still, we're not sure because we're still paying a lot. We're still continuing subsidies for a lot of clients.
Thank you. And then another question came through about just noticing that it seems like the skill set and job description between a housing advocate and a case manager is quite different. And Becky, you were saying that those roles are divided in your agency. So could you maybe share those examples of those job descriptions with us, and then we can share it with others?
Yeah, definitely. I would say that it's tough because you definitely want to be an advocate for the client, and you definitely want to be an advocate for the landlord. I don't really know how to say it any other way except for you have to have like the business smarts and then the people smarts along with it. If you're good at negotiating, if you're good at talking to people, if you understand that sometimes a landlord is coming from a business perspective instead of like a human perspective when they say no to renting your client. You know, a lot of times when I was a case manager before, I would sort of do everything in my power to win that fight for the client. When now, while I'll still do that, you have to kind of tailor it a little bit to also bring in the business aspect of it, and just understand that that's where they're coming from, but still maintaining your ability to talk to a family in you know, a really strength-based way and client-positive way. So it's tricky, but it's definitely a balance of both worlds, because you want to be effective on both sides. But hopefully that kind of answers the question. If you need me to speak more to it specifically, I can, but
I think that, yeah, that was helpful. So we just have a couple more minutes, and we have 2 questions, I think probably for Faith and Jason, about service animals. So one is, do shelters have to allow service animals, and is there a model policy for that?
The Fair Housing Partners of Washington certainly have a lot of documents available that set out guidelines and expectations for housing providers that can be very useful. But again, what the norm is a tenant requesting a reasonable accommodation will bring with him or her or request a letter signed off by a doctor that says this emotional support animal or this assistance animal, right, provides XYZ service to help me with my disability, right? It's a disability-based need. And so it doesn't, there's nothing that says certain housing providers have to and certain don't. So it doesn't distinguish in that sense. So yes, I would say yes to that.
And the second question is a perfect follow-up. So the askee said that their local property management company has told them that they only have to rent to people with certified and trained service animals, and that a doctor's letter that says the animal serves a therapeutic purpose does not constitute a service animal.
Yeah. So there's different federal versus state, right? So there's the Washington State Law Against Discrimination that does, well, technically training is not required. It is not, actually. There's different laws that vary in public. Yeah, for example, if you go to REI, for example, or any public store, right, it may say only service animals are permitted, where they can distinguish between service and emotional support. But in terms of a request, it doesn't distinguish, right? So technically, training the tenant could have trained the dog, right, or the cat, or whatever it may be. So really, it's that connection that is providing the service. It's kind of like denying someone for a wheelchair, for having a wheelchair. What I hear again most from the landlords is they're concerned because the damages, right, or if the animal is going to cause an issue with the neighbor, for example. But landlord tenant kind of protects in that sense, right, for damages or whatnot, or the dog, bites the neighbor or whatever. But again, it gets back to that letter. It gets back to that letter, that doctor. We have gotten phone calls, for example, where the letter's coming from some other state, the doctor's never met the person before, right? And so that obviously opens up another, issue per se. But a professional, a medical professional, someone who can speak to that need, letterhead, right? I sometimes see tenants where the letter is very vague. Per se, so I could certainly see a landlord asking for a little more clarification from the doctor that connects with the service animal.
But to get down to the nitty-gritty, can a landlord say only service animals and not emotional support? No, they cannot.
No, they cannot. No.
Great, thank you. All right, I think those were all of the questions that came in. So we'll stop there, and we just are nearly at the end of our time. So briefly, just to wrap up, I'm going to pass it off to my colleague, Ann Buer, who is part of the Building Changes evaluation team, to briefly explain the survey.
Thanks, Emily. Hi, everyone. So I'm just here to quickly answer the question of why do we want to evaluate this webinar with the survey. So the quick answer is in the green box. We basically use these findings to inform future trainings, technical assistance, and capacity building work that we do here. And the process basically works in a cycle. So we develop a survey based on the objectives of the training. And we take a lot of efforts to only ask questions that we're going to use. And then participants take the survey. And at that point, if we don't get enough people taking the survey, we can't be sure that the findings are truly representing what you all think about the webinar. Then we take the results and interpret them in coordination with Building Changes staff, and we also look at it in relation to other trainings we've done and where we've asked similar questions. Then finally, the report is compiled and shared and discussed with stakeholders to gain insight. And then we'll continue to use those findings as we decide the type of work we're going to take on. And so, for example, we asked in the last webinar in this series about tools that people would use to increase the amount of times they're using progressive engagement. And then we used those findings in a meeting recently to decide what kind of tools we were going to produce. We appreciate you taking 3 to 5 minutes for this quick survey. I'm going to send the survey link in the chat window to all the participants. So you can go ahead and take that survey right away. If you have time, you just copy and paste the link into your web browser. And if you don't have time now, we'll be sending an email as well, and you'll have another chance. So thanks for all of your time.
And thank you to our presenters, Becky, Faith, and Jason. You can find their contact information and mine here. And again, we'll send a notification once the slide deck and the recordings are up on our website, and you can share those with your networks. And last plug for the evaluation survey, We will be eternally grateful and remember that good karma. All right, thanks everyone, and have a great rest of your day.